There's a moment you probably know well. You're sitting in a room full of people, a party, a family gathering, an office, somewhere you were told you should want to be, and you feel it. Not loneliness exactly, something stranger than loneliness, a kind of distance, like you're watching the whole scene through glass. People are laughing, talking, filling the air with sound, and you are there, technically present, technically participating, and yet some quieter, more honest part of you is already somewhere else, already home, already alone in the way that actually feels like yourself. And then you go home. You close the door, the noise falls away, and something in your chest loosens, the way a fist unclenches after holding too tight for too long. You exhale. You didn't even realize you'd been holding your breath. This is not a problem. This is not a disorder. This is not something that needs to be fixed or apologized for or explained to people who will never quite understand it anyway. But society has spent a long time telling you otherwise. We want to talk about that today. We want to talk about the psychology of people who genuinely prefer their own company. Not because they're broken, not because they've failed at connection, not because something went wrong in their development, but because something went deeply, profoundly right in their understanding of themselves. We want to give language to an experience that millions of people carry quietly, often with a low hum of shame that they don't entirely deserve. Because here is what psychology actually tells us about people who prefer solitude. It tells us they are not deficient. It tells us they are not antisocial in any clinical sense. It tells us they are often among the most self-aware, most creative, most emotionally intelligent people in any room. It tells us that the preference for solitude is not a retreat from life, but a very specific, very valid way of moving through it. And it tells us something else, something that most people never get to hear, that the discomfort you feel in crowds, the relief you feel in silence, the way your inner world feels more real and more nourishing than most of what the outside world offers. All of that has a name. All of that has been studied. All of that is recognized. You are not alone in preferring to be alone. Let's start at the beginning. Let's start with what it actually feels like, from the inside, to be someone whose natural orientation is toward solitude. You probably don't describe yourself as a loner. That word carries weight, carries connotation, carries the image of someone bitter and withdrawn and fundamentally rejected. That's not you. Or if it is you on your worst days, it's not the whole truth of you. The more honest description is something quieter, something like you have a rich inner life that doesn't require an audience. Something like you find most social interaction genuinely draining in a way that doesn't happen to everyone. Something like you have discovered through years of lived experience that you are your own best company in a way that isn't arrogance, but is simply true. You might go entire days without speaking to another person and feel not deprived but restored. You might find that your best ideas come in silence, in the early morning before the world wakes up, or late at night when everyone else has gone quiet. You might find that small talk, the weather, the weekend, the performative catching up costs you something real, something you can feel depleting in your body, while a long conversation about something that actually matters can leave you energized for days. You might have noticed that you don't use noise to fill space the way other people do. You're comfortable in silence in a way that unsettles people who aren't. You can sit in a room with nothing playing, no music, no podcast, no background television, and feel not bored but full. Your own thoughts are genuinely good company. Your own mind is a place you actually want to be. If this is already resonating with you, go ahead and like this video and subscribe. It helps more people find conversations like this one, and we have a lot more of them waiting for you. This is not universal. Most people find extended silence uncomfortable. Most people reach for their phones, their earbuds, their social media feeds, not because they're weak or shallow, but because the human nervous system evolved in community, evolved to find silence and aloneness slightly threatening. For most of human history, being alone meant being in danger. The tribe was safety. Separation was risk. So the discomfort most people feel when they're truly alone is ancient. It's adaptive. It's wired in. Which makes it all the more striking when someone comes along who doesn't feel that discomfort, who feels the opposite, who finds the tribe exhausting and the silence safe. Psychology has spent a long time trying to understand why some people are built this way. The most familiar framework, the one most people have encountered, is the introversion-extroversion spectrum. Hans Eysenck, the British psychologist who did foundational work on personality in the mid-20th century, proposed that introverts and extroverts differ in their baseline level of cortical arousal, essentially how stimulated their nervous systems are at rest. Extroverts, in this model, have lower baseline arousal and seek stimulation from the outside world to reach an optimal level. Introverts have higher baseline arousal and are easily overstimulated, which is why they prefer quieter environments, smaller groups, and more controlled social exposure. This is why a crowded, noisy party that energizes an extrovert can leave an introvert feeling like they've run a marathon. It's not a character flaw, it's neurological. The introvert's nervous system is processing more, registering more, responding more intensely to every stimulus in the room. The noise, the light, the social cues, the emotional undercurrents, the effort of conversation. By the end of the evening, they're not just tired, they're overloaded, and solitude isn't just pleasant for them, it's genuinely restorative. It's the only environment in which their nervous system can actually reset. But introversion alone doesn't fully capture what we're talking about. Because there are introverts who are still deeply social, who crave connection even if they need recovery time afterward. What we're exploring today is something that sits at a particular intersection. The preference for solitude that goes beyond introversion into something more deliberate, more chosen, more philosophical. The person who doesn't just need alone time to recharge, but has come to genuinely prefer their own company as a way of life. Psychologists sometimes describe this as high autonomy, a personality trait characterized by a strong preference for self-direction, self-sufficiency, and independence from social approval. People high in autonomy don't just tolerate being alone, they actively value it. They've built lives that protect their solitude. They've learned to trust their own judgment in a way that makes external validation feel unnecessary rather than merely unavailable. And here's what's important to understand about this. High autonomy is not the same as avoidance. It is not the same as fear. There's a crucial distinction in psychology between solitude that is chosen and solitude that is imposed. Between the person who is alone because they want to be and the person who is alone because connection has proven too painful, too dangerous, too disappointing. Both experiences are real. Both deserve compassion, but they are different experiences with different psychological signatures, and conflating them does a disservice to both. The person we're talking about today, the one who genuinely prefers their own company, is not hiding. They are not nursing wounds in the dark. They are not lonely people pretending to be fine. They have simply discovered something that not everyone discovers, that the quality of their inner life is rich enough to sustain them, that they are, in the truest sense of the phrase, good company for themselves. And that discovery, when it's genuine, is one of the most quietly radical things a person can arrive at. There's a concept in psychology called self-sufficiency that goes deeper than mere independence. It describes not just the ability to function alone, but the genuine comfort with one's own inner world. Psychologists who study self-sufficiency have found that people high in this trait tend to show lower levels of loneliness even when they spend more time alone than their peers. They tend to have stronger internal loci of control, meaning they locate the source of their well-being inside themselves rather than in their circumstances or other people. They tend to report higher levels of meaning and purpose, not because their lives are objectively more meaningful, but because they've developed the internal capacity to generate meaning, rather than waiting for it to be given to them by social experience. This is not isolation. This is not withdrawal. This is a particular kind of psychological maturity that our culture tends to undervalue, because our culture has a very specific and very narrow idea of what health and happiness look like. Our culture tells us that the good life is a social life, that the healthy person is surrounded by friends, embedded in community, never without company. That loneliness is the enemy and togetherness is the cure. That if you prefer your own company, something must have gone wrong. You must be depressed. You must be avoidant. You must have attachment wounds that need healing. You must be fixed. And sometimes, that's true. Sometimes the preference for solitude is a symptom of something that deserves attention and care. Sometimes it is depression wearing the mask of contentment. Sometimes it is fear of intimacy disguised as a preference for independence. Sometimes it is the aftermath of betrayal or abandonment, the way a person learns to need less because needing more has cost them too much. We want to be honest about that. We don't want to romanticize every form of aloneness or suggest that all withdrawal is wisdom. There is a version of this that is pain. And if you recognize yourself in that version, if your preference for solitude comes with a low, persistent ache, a longing you've learned to suppress, a grief you've stopped letting yourself feel, then that deserves its own kind of attention, its own kind of gentleness. But that is not the only version, and it is not the version that gets enough airtime. Because there is another version, the version where the preference for solitude is not a wound, but a gift, not a symptom, but a way of being, not a problem to be solved, but a self to be understood. And for the person living that version, the constant pressure to be more social, more available, more embedded in community feels not like an invitation, but like an accusation, like being told that the way you naturally are is fundamentally wrong, like being asked to perform an extroversion that doesn't belong to you in order to be accepted by a world that has decided connection looks one specific way. Let's talk about what it costs to live this way in a world that doesn't understand you. The social pressure on people who prefer solitude is relentless and often invisible. It operates through small moments rather than dramatic confrontations. It's the co-worker who asks why you're eating lunch alone with a tone that implies something must be wrong. It's the family member who introduces you to every gathering as someone who needs to get out more, as if your contentment at home is a problem they're working to solve. It's the friend who takes your need for space personally, who reads your quiet as rejection, who asks, "Are you okay?" with a concern that is genuine but also subtly communicating that your way of being is worrying. It's the culture that produces 1,000 articles about the loneliness epidemic and 0 articles about the people who are genuinely fine, who are not lonely, who are choosing their solitude with full awareness and finding it nourishing. It's the assumption baked into every social structure, the open office, the team-building exercise, the mandatory happy hour, that more togetherness is always better, that the person who wants to be left alone is the outlier who needs to be brought into the fold. And over time, this pressure accumulates. It creates a kind of low-grade self-doubt, a background question. Am I okay? Is there something wrong with me? Should I want this more than I do? Should I be trying harder to fit in, to show up, to need people the way people are supposed to need people? Psychologists call this social comparison pressure, the way we evaluate our own preferences and behaviors against the perceived norm, and find ourselves deficient when we don't match. For people who prefer solitude, this comparison is almost always unfavorable because the norm they're being compared against is built for extroverts, built for people who find social engagement energizing rather than depleting. And the cost of this constant comparison is real. Research on minority stress, originally developed to understand the psychological burden carried by people whose identities are stigmatized by the dominant culture, suggests that the experience of having your fundamental nature pathologized, of being repeatedly told that who you are is a problem, creates a specific kind of chronic stress that is distinct from the stress of any particular difficult event. It's the stress of navigating a world that wasn't built for you, the stress of being perpetually misread, the stress of performing a version of yourself that doesn't quite fit. This is what many people who prefer solitude carry, not a longing for more connection, but a longing to be understood, not a wish to be different, but a wish to be accepted as they are. And that wish is valid. That longing is real. You deserve to be understood exactly as you are. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. When did you first realize that your preference for solitude was just who you are, rather than something that needed fixing? What was that moment like for you? Let's go deeper into the inner world of the person who prefers solitude. Because this is where it gets genuinely interesting. This is where the psychology reveals something that most people, looking from the outside, completely miss. People who prefer their own company tend to have exceptionally rich inner lives. This is not a coincidence. It is, in many ways, the mechanism. When you don't spend your available mental and emotional energy on social performance, on managing impressions, on navigating group dynamics, on the constant low-level work of being perceived, that energy goes somewhere else. It goes inward. It goes into thinking, imagining, reflecting, creating. Research on creativity consistently finds that solitude is one of its most essential conditions. Not the only condition. Collaboration and exposure to other minds matters too. But the condition that is most systematically undervalued in our productivity-obsessed, open-plan office, always-connected culture. The psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who spent decades studying the conditions that produce creative breakthroughs and states of deep engagement, found that many of the most creatively productive people in his research actively protected their solitude, not as a luxury, but as a professional necessity. The ability to be alone with your thoughts, to follow an idea without interruption, to let your mind wander in the specific way that produces unexpected connections. This is not idleness. This is where the work actually happens. And it's not just creativity. Research on self-reflection and psychological growth suggests that solitude is one of the primary conditions under which people develop genuine self-knowledge. The philosopher Paul Tillich wrote that language has created the word loneliness to express the pain of being alone, and the word solitude to express the glory of being alone. That distinction matters enormously. Loneliness is the experience of unwanted aloneness, of wanting connection and not having it. Solitude is the experience of chosen aloneness, of being with yourself in a way that is nourishing rather than painful. And the capacity for genuine solitude, for being alone with yourself without distress, without the need to fill the silence, without the anxiety that drives so many people to their phones the moment they're left without stimulation, is itself a marker of psychological health. The British pediatrician and psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott wrote about what he called the capacity to be alone as one of the most important signs of emotional maturity. His insight was counterintuitive. He argued that the ability to be truly alone develops in the presence of another person, that a child who has experienced secure attachment, who has internalized the presence of a reliable, loving caregiver, develops the ability to be alone because they carry that presence inside them. They are never truly alone because they have a stable inner world that holds them. This is not the same as the aloneness of someone who has been abandoned, who has learned to need less because needing has proven dangerous. This is a different kind of aloneness. a full aloneness, a chosen aloneness, an aloneness that comes from having enough inside you to sustain yourself. And for the person who has genuinely developed this capacity, being alone is not a deprivation. It is a homecoming. There's something else happening in the inner world of the person who prefers solitude that deserves to be named. Something that has to do with authenticity, with the particular cost of social performance, and with what happens when a person stops performing. Most social interaction requires a degree of self-management. We modulate our tone, our opinions, our emotional expression based on context, audience, social cues. We present slightly different versions of ourselves in different settings. This is not dishonesty. It's social intelligence. It's appropriate adaptation. It's what allows people to function in community. But it has a cost. Psychologists call this ego depletion, the way that self-regulation draws on a limited cognitive and emotional resource, leaving us tired in a specific way that rest doesn't fully address. For people who are highly sensitive to social cues, who process interpersonal dynamics with great intensity, who feel the emotional undercurrents of a room without being able to turn that perception off, the ego depletion of extended social interaction is significant. They are not just tired at the end of a party. They are depleted in a way that requires real recovery time, real solitude, real silence. And when they finally get that solitude, when they're finally alone and no longer managing how they're being perceived, something releases. They become more themselves. They stop performing. The version of them that exists in solitude, the one who thinks the thoughts they don't say aloud, who feels the feelings they've learned to moderate in company, who follows the interests and ideas that don't fit neatly into social conversation. That version is often the truest version, the one they trust most, the one they actually like. This is what people who prefer solitude are often protecting when they choose their own company, not just peace and quiet, not just rest. They are protecting access to themselves, to the version of themselves that only exists when no one is watching. And that is not a small thing. That is, in many ways, everything. Here's the truth that most people miss about people who prefer solitude. They are not people who don't need connection. They are people who need connection to be real, to be deep, to be worth the cost. They have a low tolerance for superficiality, not because they're arrogant or antisocial, but because they've discovered that shallow connection doesn't actually nourish them. It costs them the same energy as deep connection, but gives them almost nothing in return. The person who prefers solitude is not someone who doesn't value relationships. They are someone who values them so much that they'd rather have one conversation that matters than 100 that don't. They'd rather have one friend who knows them completely than 20 who know only the performance. They'd rather spend an evening alone with their own thoughts than an evening in company that leaves them feeling more alone than the solitude would have. This is not antisocial. This is a very specific, very discerning relationship with what connection means and what it requires. Psychologists who study what they call high-quality relationships versus high-quantity relationships have found that the number of social connections a person has is a far less reliable predictor of well-being than the depth and authenticity of those connections. People with many shallow relationships often report higher loneliness than people with fewer but deeper ones. The person who prefers solitude, who is selective about their social investment, who would rather be alone than surrounded by people they can't be real with, that person is often making a psychologically sophisticated choice, even if society reads it as a deficiency. They have learned something that takes most people years to understand, if they ever do, that the quality of your inner life matters more than the quantity of your social life. That being alone with a mind you trust is better than being surrounded by people you have to perform for. That solitude, chosen and inhabited with intention, is not the absence of something good. It is the presence of something rare. And if you know someone in your life who has never quite had language for this experience, someone who has always felt a little strange for preferring quiet over crowds, share this video with them. Sometimes the most meaningful thing we can do for another person is hand them the words for something they've been carrying without a name. That kind of recognition can change how someone sees themselves, and that ripple is worth more than we usually give it credit for. Let's talk about what this looks like across a life, because the preference for solitude doesn't just shape evenings and weekends. It shapes everything. It shapes the work you're drawn to, the relationships you form, the way you move through the world. People who prefer solitude often find themselves drawn to work that allows for deep, focused engagement rather than constant collaboration. Research, writing, coding, art, music, research, design, analysis. Work that rewards the ability to concentrate, to think through complexity, to spend long hours with a problem without needing to process it socially. This is not a limitation. This is a specific kind of cognitive strength that many of the most important contributions to human knowledge and culture have come from. They often form relationships slowly and carefully, investing deeply in a small number of people rather than broadly in many. Their friendships tend to be characterized by unusual depth and honesty, the kind of relationships where you can go months without speaking and pick up exactly where you left off, because the connection is based on genuine understanding rather than social maintenance. They often make extraordinary partners for the people who can understand them, who don't take their need for space as rejection, who recognize that the version of themselves they share with very few people is the most precious thing they have to offer. They often have a particular relationship with time. Where many people fill time, they inhabit it. Where many people rush through silence to get to the next stimulation, they settle into it, find texture in it, discover that the most interesting things tend to happen in the quiet spaces between events rather than in the events themselves. And they often carry a particular kind of wisdom about what actually matters, what is worth their limited social energy, what is worth the cost of showing up. Because everything costs them something, they've learned to be selective. And that selectivity, that discernment, is not coldness. It is a form of respect for themselves and for the people they choose to let in. There's something that happens to people who spend a lot of time with themselves that is worth naming. Something that the philosopher Blaise Pascal gestured at when he wrote that all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. He meant it as a critique of human restlessness, of the way we flee from ourselves into distraction and activity. But there's another way to read it, as a recognition that sitting quietly in a room alone is genuinely hard, that most people can't do it, that the ones who can, who have made peace with their own company, who can inhabit silence without panic, have developed something rare and difficult and genuinely valuable. The capacity to be alone without loneliness is not passive. It is not the absence of something. It is the presence of a relationship, the relationship you have with yourself. And like all relationships, it requires tending. It requires honesty. It requires the willingness to be with yourself as you actually are, not as you wish you were, not as you perform yourself to be, but as you are in the quiet moments when no one is watching. People who prefer solitude are in many ways people who have done this work, who have sat with themselves long enough to know themselves, who have developed an inner life rich enough to sustain them, who have built a relationship with their own mind that they trust and value and return to, the way you return to a home that actually feels like home. That is not a pathology. That is a profound and undervalued form of psychological health. And yet we want to hold space for the complexity here, because not every preference for solitude is this clean, this chosen, this free. Sometimes the preference for solitude is woven through with grief, the grief of connection that didn't work, of trust that was broken, of belonging that was never offered. Sometimes it is a preference that was shaped by pain, even if it no longer hurts in the same way. Sometimes the person who prefers their own company has simply learned through enough disappointing evidence that other people are unreliable in ways that their own inner world is not. And even the preference for solitude that has its roots in disappointment or loss or learned self-protection, even that deserves compassion rather than correction. Because the human capacity to adapt, to find ways of sustaining ourselves when the world hasn't been generous, is not a failure. It is a form of resilience. It is the self doing what it needs to do to survive, and then, if it's lucky, to thrive. The question is not whether your preference for solitude is pure or complicated. The question is whether it serves you, whether it allows you to live in a way that feels true to yourself, whether the life you're building in your chosen aloneness is one that holds meaning, that holds growth, that holds the occasional deep connection that reminds you why other people exist. And if it does, if you are genuinely nourished by your solitude, if you are genuinely at home in your own company, if the quiet is genuinely a gift rather than a consolation, then you don't owe anyone an explanation. You don't owe anyone a performance of sociability that doesn't fit you. You don't owe the world a version of yourself that is more comfortable for people who don't understand you. You are allowed to be this, exactly this, the person who finds more in silence than in noise, the person whose inner world is their primary home, the person who has learned that being alone doesn't have to mean being lonely, and that the two things are not the same, have never been the same, and were only ever confused by a culture that forgot to make room for the people who are genuinely, deeply, unapologetically at home with themselves. This is not a character flaw. This is not a social failure. This is not something that needs to be fixed or overcome or apologized for. This is who you are, and who you are is enough. There's a final thing we want to say, and it's this. The world needs people like you. Not in the sentimental, everyone is special way, but in a specific, concrete, genuinely important way. The world needs people who can think without an audience, who can follow an idea into the quiet places where most people don't go, who can be comfortable with uncertainty and complexity and the long, slow work of understanding something deeply rather than quickly, who are not dependent on external approval to know what they think, what they value, what they believe. The world needs people who have a relationship with themselves that is honest enough to be trusted, who know their own minds well enough to use them, who have spent enough time in silence to have something real to say when they speak. That is you. That is what you've been building in all those quiet hours, all those solitary evenings, all those moments when you chose your own company over the noise of the world and found, to your quiet satisfaction, that it was enough. It has always been enough. You have always been enough. If this video gave language to something you've been carrying quietly, if it helped you feel a little less alone in your preference for aloneness, please stay. Subscribe for more deep psychological explorations, conversations that try to see the parts of human experience that usually go unspoken. And if you feel safe, share something in the comments. Tell us what solitude means to you. Tell us what you found in the quiet that you couldn't find anywhere else. Someone out there is reading the comments right now, wondering if they're the only one who feels this way. Your words might be exactly what they need to feel a little less strange, a little more understood, a little more at home in who they are. Thank you for watching. And if this way of understanding yourself as someone whose inner world runs deep, who feels everything more than most people realize, resonates with you, the video on the psychology of the empath, who feels everything, explores why some people are wired to absorb the emotional world around them, what it costs and what it means to finally understand that sensitivity as a strength rather than a burden.